All right, so we're going to talk about just a few of what we call the guiding principles of equity literacy. You should have read the Equity Literacy Institute's handout. So you see we actually have several more of these that we're going to talk about today. And we're going to do a whole separate mini course just on going through those each of those principles a little bit more slowly than we're going to do them here and give examples of each. But we just wanted to give you a little taste of these because in a way these are the heart of the equity literacy framework. We saved this for last within this mini course because these also provide sort of a summary of things that in a way we've already talked about. We just haven't given them a name. And we have found it very useful when we work with schools, districts, universities, nonprofit organizations, whoever we're working with, to just sort of give a name to some of the underlying values that inform the overall equity literacy framework. So the sort of purpose of the guiding principles, other than just to give that language to these values, is to provide some guidance for maximizing the transformative potential of equity work. In a way, it's sort of an efficiency thing. If our goal is equity, what are some basic principles or values that we can hold ourselves accountable to so we're really moving with all deliberate speed toward that equity goal and we don't get sort of off on detours. How can we sort of, another way to think about these principles is that in a way they're sort of measuring sticks that we can use to assess the equity work that we're doing in our organizations. So I'm just going to talk about four of these. Like you saw in the handout, there are many more of them, but I just wanted to give you a little taste as kind of a last piece of this mini course on the equity literacy framework. So the first equity literacy principle, this is sort of the principle that holds together the rest of the principles, is called the direct confrontation principle. Again, the idea here is something you've heard me talk about already, but we just haven't given a name to it. So the direct confrontation principle says that an equity commitment requires direct confrontations with inequity. So we need to avoid the strategies, programs, and initiatives that are not a threat to inequity, that were not created for inequity. Now, not created to eliminate inequity, I should say. Now, one clarification here, when a lot of people hear direct confrontation principle, they think what I'm saying is that we need to go directly confront people. And although when somebody is doing damage, sometimes we do have to directly confront people, that's not what the direct confrontation principle is referring to. The direct confrontation principle goes back to that idea we've been talking about over and over. Identify the inequity, eliminate the inequity. So it's about confronting the inequities, naming the way inequity is operating, and then directly confront that through those abilities that we talked about in the last segment across all of the different dimensions of equity we talked about in the segment previous to that. So you can see how this is sort of holding all of that stuff together. The next principle is called the prioritization principle. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the whole equality equity thing that people talk about when they define equity. Sort of in relationship to equality. We talked about that a little bit earlier in this mini course. We talked about it in a lot more detail in the defining equity and inequity mini course that preceded this one. So if you want more of a conversation about that, I encourage you to go check out that mini course as well. It's also free. The prioritization principle says that in order to reach equity, we need to actively prioritize the interests of the people, the students, the families whose interests historically have not been prioritized. So that relates to equality and equity in the sense that, if we have one student who has this level of access and opportunity and another with this level of access and opportunity, and we give them all the same thing, then they both might get a little bump up in their access and opportunity, but the gap is still there, right? So equity is about eliminating the gap. The only way to eliminate the gap is to actually prioritize the interests of the students who are on the losing end of that gap. Because historically, the way that these students ended up on the winning end of that gap is that their interests have been prioritized, and the curriculum and the pedagogy and the policy and those sorts of things. So what that means in practice is when we're developing our approaches, like an example I've used throughout this mini course is family engagement. Is there a way to construct family engagement that prioritizes access to family engagement to families experiencing poverty or families who speak languages other than English at home? Can we do it in a way that actually prioritizes their interests? And what we find when we do this, because some people say, well, then aren't you being unfair to other students, to wealthier students, say? But what we find is actually that's not the case. And the example of family engagement is a good example of this, in the sense that if we design our family engagement approach based on what makes it most accessible for the lowest income families, well, the wealthiest families and middle class families, they're the ones with the most flexibility to begin with. They can adjust to that, but lower income families can't adjust so easily to us doing family engagement in ways that assume everybody has working transportation, everyone can afford childcare, and those sorts of things. So when we're developing policy, when we're developing practice, it's not enough to just say, how do we make this equal? It's how do we prioritize the interests of the students who have been cheated out of equitable access and opportunity until that gap is closed. Then we've reached equity. The third principle is called the equity ideology principle. And again, you've heard me refer to this already. So in a way, this is just a review and it's just a little language for it. The equity ideology principle says that sustainable shifts in practice and policy and institutional culture and those sorts of things that we've been talking about are driven by ideological change. If we don't have the ideological shifts, the practical shifts aren't going to stick anyway. In other words, if I'm working in a school where teachers have a deficit view of students who are experiencing poverty or a deficit view of students of color, then there are no practical strategies that are going to make that teacher an effective teacher for those students, because the teacher is still filtering everything through that racial bias. So you need to address the racial bias, and then the strategies are going to be more sustainable because they're not going to be going up against the ideological shortcomings when it comes to equity. Finally, because we have to have our one hashtag principle, we call this the fix injustice, not kids principle. And again, you've heard me talk about this a bunch of times in this mini course, and if you took the previous mini course and that one too. But this principle says that equity efforts should never ever focus on adjusting the cultures, mindsets, values, emotions, behaviors of students or families from groups that are marginalized. Students or families of color, low-income students or families, LGBTQ students, students with disabilities. Equity work is not about adjusting them or not about helping them adjust to the inequitable conditions. Equity efforts always focus on transforming the conditions that marginalize students and families from marginalized groups. Right, so what are the challenges and barriers? What are the inequities? How do we eliminate the inequities? So again, there are several more of these that provide kind of a more robust picture, but I think starting with these four is a great place to get us rolling. So this is going to be our last reflection exercise for this class. Again, this question will be in the next lesson within this chapter. We're basically going to list the principles we just discussed and have you reflect on which of these principles would be the biggest transformation in your school or district or organization if people embraced it. So we'll end there, and I'll see you back in the course.